Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. This is the drafting of the Declaration of Independence with our good friend Deirdre O'Sullivan, who's going to be giving us a history talk on this important and noteworthy subject. And so without further ado, let's turn things over to Deirdre. Deirdre, it's all yours. Take it away.
Thank you, Robert, and I really appreciate Robert for allowing me to do these presentations. I have a great interest in history, and when I met Robert and found this group, I was like, people who understand me. So obviously I appreciate Robert and him allowing me to do things like this. And what we're going to be talking about today is the drafting the Declaration of Independence. For those of you who did attend my previous presentation on Lexington and Concord, we are going to pull a lot of slides from that. So some of this will be a repeat, but we will also be talking about how we got to the Declaration of Independence, what led to it, who were the people involved, and then finally we'll talk about actually what it says. So let's go ahead and we start with a quote from John Adams. So once the Declaration was signed, this is a quote in which he said, I'm probably going to say some of these words wrong, but we'll go for it. The Dons, the Banshais, the Grandees, the Patricians, the Shazams, I don't even know how to pronounce that, the Nabus, call them what names you please, sign and sigh and groan and fret, and sometimes stamp and phone and curse, but all in vain. The decree has gone forth and it cannot be recalled. A more equal liberty than has prevailed in other parts of the earth must be established in America. Next slide. Sorry, one back. So what are we going to talk about today? So we're going to do very quickly a brief history of the 13 original colonies. Actually, if you can move forward one. I know you always think you're moving ahead, but you're not. We're also going to talk about the 7 Years' War, how it ends. It ends in 1763, but within 12 years of the war ending, the American colonies will be in a state of open armed rebellion against British rule. So it really happens very fast. So in a 12-year period, the American colonists go from being loyal subjects of the British Crown to an armed open rebellion against it. I think somebody mentioned they can't hear in the chat room. I think my volume is turned up as high as it can get. Yeah. In the spring of 1776, the Second Continental Congress is meeting in Philadelphia. On June 6th, one of the delegates, Richard Henry Lee, arrives with a resolution from Virginia to dissolve all ties with Great Britain. Soon after, a committee is established to draft a possible legal document to codify the resolution, and Thomas Jefferson is chosen to write the first draft. On June 2nd, 1776, the 12 colonies will vote to pass the declaration, with one colony abstaining, that is New York. We'll talk about how that happened. And then finally, the newly printed Declaration of Independence is going to be read out loud to a crowd in Philadelphia on July 8th. We'll talk about July 4th and how that all came to be kind of a federal holiday. Next slide. So let's talk about the numbers. One of the things I want to emphasize is the idea that the winning of the American Revolution was not inevitable. In anything, it was, all of the statistics were against them. So let's talk about some of the numbers that existed around the time of the American Revolution. And the first one, of course, is population. So population of the United States, or the 13 colonies, was 2.5 million, of which 500,000 were slaves. So there were 2 million people really to draw from. One of the others was, of course, the population of Great Britain is 8 million. You have about 200,000 people who served in the Continental Army. We kind of know that number because those are the people who requested a pension as a result of fighting in the war. So once the war was over, about 200,000 people requested a pension. And out of those, but only about 48,000 at any one time ever really served, in the Continental Army. They were kind of separate armies at a time, but there were really only 48,000 at any one time. And out of those, the 48 of the 200,000, about 7,000 were African Americans. More African Americans served in the British Army, about 3 times as many than did in the American Army. There were about 7,000 soldiers in the colonies in 1775. By 1778, there were 52,000. So the British colonies not only had a larger population, but they certainly had a much more professional and disciplined army than anything that the colonists could come up with. The Royal Navy had about 250 ships. The Americans had none. So what are the American casualties throughout the war? Again, these are all approximate numbers, but about 6,800 were killed in action, about 6,000 were wounded, and about 20,000 were taken prisoner. Out of those, about half of them would die in captivity. The British casualties, again, they don't kind of break it down between dead, wounded, and missing. So we just have kind of a general total of 22,000. So who could the British had allies? And their biggest allies, of course, were German Hessians, and about 30,000 of them served in the British or with the British Army in America. About half of them would never return to Germany. They either died, but most of them actually decided after the war to settle in the United States. The American allies were, of course, the French. They sent about 12,000 soldiers as well as a part of their navy, but this didn't occur until 1779. Next slide. Yeah, there were, somebody put a question in, there were Africans, both slaves and free people, who served in the British Army, and more Africans who were in this country at the time of the American Revolution served in the British Army than did with the American Army. And one of the reasons for that is because they were provided guarantees of freedom afterwards. So we're going to go through very briefly a timeline of the American colonial period. Next slide. So the first permanent English settlement in the United States is first British settlement in the United States is going to be Jamestown. And that's going to be in 1607. Then in 1620, the English Puritans are going to arrive in Plymouth to establish another colony. In 1623, English fishermen are going to arrive in New Hampshire. In 1624, Dutch settlers are going to arrive in the New Netherlands, the area that is kind of now is New York. In 1634, English Catholics are going to arrive in Maryland. 1635, English Puritans are going to arrive in Connecticut. 1636, Roger Williams is actually going to leave Massachusetts, or going to be kicked out of Massachusetts because he has, heretical ideas, and he's actually going to be no longer a Puritan. He's going to start his own church in Rhode Island. Now, 1636, that was now known as Harvard College, is going to be established in Massachusetts. The idea is to educate the clergy. So now think about how fast all that happens. Now, in 1620, the Puritans arrive in Plymouth. The first winter, almost half of them are going to die of diseases involved in starvation. 16 years after they arrive in Massachusetts, they're going to start their own university. And the purpose of this is, as more towns are being established in and around Massachusetts, each town is going to have a church, and it's going to have, associated with that, it's going to have a school. And each church is going to need a minister. And so instead of trying to get all these ministers coming in from England, they're actually going to start their own process for ordaining ministers in the United States and in Massachusetts. Next slide. Sorry, I think we need to go back one. In 1664, the English are going to capture the New Netherlands from the Dutch, and it will become New York, New Jersey, and Delaware. In 1670, Charlestown is going to be established in South Carolina by the English. 1681, Pennsylvania will be founded by the Quakers in the form of William Penn. 1693, the College of William and Mary in Virginia is founded. 1700, the population of Europeans, again, most of them are English, but we do have French, we do have Dutch, we have some some Irish in there, some Scottish in there, but again, most of them are going to be English. And the population of the British colonies is going to be about 250,000. In 1707, Great Britain is formed, which is basically formally uniting both England and Scotland. Hopefully I use the term British, but sometimes I go back and I use the word English. So before 1707, they were English colonies. After 1707, they become British colonies. 1715, the Age of Enlightenment begins in Europe. We'll talk more about that later. Next slide. In 1733, Georgia is going to be established as a barrier between the Carolinas and Spanish-held Florida. In 1750, the Cumberland Gap, which is a passage through the Appalachian Mountains, is going to be revealed by Thomas Walker and is later going to become famous by Daniel Boone. I'm really not going to talk about this issue again. So in 1756 through 1763 is the 7-Year War. Now, the 7-Year War, Churchill once called was the First World War when he wrote a history of it. And most of this warfare is going to be fought in Europe, and several million people are going to die as a result of the 7-Year War. And it's really not going to change a whole lot in Europe, but territories are going to be gained in the New World as a result of this war. So the war is going to be fought a little bit in the North America between the British and the French, and the British are going to walk away as one of the victors of this particular war. Now, the end result of the war is no territorial changes in Europe. However, Great Britain now has all of the territory from the Mississippi River basically to the East Coast. So it has all this new territory. It also gets Florida from Spain. So all of this is great, but at the same time, they now have this huge debt. The national debt has, I think it was at least doubled, if not more than that, tripled as a result of the 7-Year War. So they now have to figure out how they're going to pay off this enormous debt, and that's going to have a huge influence in the revolution, in the time frame of the before the revolution. Next slide. So let's talk about an American colonist versus the British counterpart. So one of the questions is out of the, in 1700, what percentage of the 250,000 English settlers were slaves? And to tell you the truth, I don't know the answer to that question. I would say it's less than 10%, but it varies widely from colony to colony. But it is not, a lot of the slave population isn't there in 1700. They do arrive throughout the 1700s. How many are there in the year 1700? I apologize, I don't know off the top of my head. Very good question, though. So by the mid-1700s, an American male was much more likely to read than his counterpart in England. About 70% of all Americans could read by the mid-1700s. The American male he also ate much better. He had a much better diet. He was much more likely to own land and or have his own trade. For example, rope maker, sailor, merchant, etc. And his children were much more likely to survive to adulthood. The average family in the United States had about 8 children. Printers were also very common in the colonies. Both newspapers and pamphlets were very common throughout the cities and in the major towns. Before the war, there was a mail system set up throughout the colonies, and news spread very fast. We're also going to talk about the ideas of the Enlightenment. The ideas of the Enlightenment first arrived to Yale College, and a new curriculum is developed around it. By the time of the American Revolution, there were 9 colleges in the United States, and all of them were teaching elements that they had learned as a result of the Enlightenment. Next slide. So let's talk about the Age of Enlightenment. Now, if we go to the next slide, it's very, very difficult to take all of the ideas of the Enlightenment and reduce it down to 3 bullets. You can't. So what I really have to do then is kind of, take some of the ideas and throw it in there and allow people to kind of go beyond that, because this is not what the presentation is about. So for historians, they're going to put the timeline of the Age of Enlightenment. They're going to start with the death of the Sun King, who was Louis XIV of France in 1750, and they're going to end the Age of Enlightenment with the French Revolution in 1789. Now, does all the ideas within the French Revolution fall within this time period? No, but somebody had to put a beginning and an end on it, and this is what is generally agreed to. So one of the central themes of the Enlightenment is the idea of reason, the power of human beings to understand the universe and to improve their own condition. This will have a huge impact on, even through today, our understanding of religion, human nature, science, philosophy, and politics. One of the central themes is the idea of individual liberty and the rejection of authority. In 1851, Thomas Hobbes wrote the very famous book, Leviathan. And he talks about the state of nature in which all individuals are equal, but to impose peace and order, there must be a social contract between the people and their sovereign. Now, when he was writing this, is in the middle of the English Civil War, and the English king had actually just been beheaded. But he really believed that the only way to kind of control individuals, the authority that could do that would be that of the king. Now, John Locke is going to take these ideas and kind of swing them in a different direction. He is going to argue that there are natural rights that individuals have, such as life, liberty, and property, that could never be taken away. That these rights were in fact inalienable rights and could not be limited by the sovereign. Now, when I say these words, why do they sound familiar? So I'm talking about inalienable rights. I'm talking about life, liberty, and property. Why do some of these terms sound so familiar? Again, if you want to put something in the chat room. Yeah, Thomas Jefferson is going to take a lot of the ideas from the Enlightenment, which he's going to learn at the College of William and Mary, and he is going to put a lot of these ideas into the Declaration of Independence, which we are obviously going to talk about today. So let's go to the next slide. So let's talk about the path to revolution. Next slide. So we've talked about the fact that the 7 Years' War is now over. Great Britain has enormous debts, and people have been coming to the United States. And soldiers spent time in the United States, politicians have spent time in the United States, and they've gone back to England and say, you know, that this colony, you know, that's going on right now in the area, what is now the United States, they're doing really well. In fact, they are doing so well, I think that they need to pay more for their own defense. So when you think about it, if you are a colonist in, let's say, Massachusetts, you are not allowed to buy goods from any other European country. Now, there's not a whole lot of production going on in the United States. So if you're going to buy furniture, if you're going to buy weapons, if you are going to buy powder, a lot of that is going to be made in Europe. But you can only purchase it if it is made in Great Britain. So one of the things in which they're going to do is they're going to raise the duties or the tariffs on all goods being brought from Great Britain and being sold in the United States. And these are goods in which, in order to survive, you actually need. But one of the first things that's going to be taxed is sugar. Now, sugar is a luxury item at the time in 1764, but it is something that most, or not most, but a lot of Americans can afford at the time. It's a luxury item, but it is something that can be bought, and it is a valuable item, but it is something that a lot of people have access to. So one of the first things they do tax is sugar. And then in the year later, they introduced the Stamp Act. And the Stamp Act is a direct tax on all official documents. So if you're going to do a will, if you're going to sue somebody, if you're going to purchase land, if you're going to purchase any sort of legal document between individuals, all contracts, all of those are going to be taxed. And so that means that any sort of business that is going to be done in what is now the United States is going to be taxed. And that also impacts a lot of people, especially merchants. So as a result of this, the Sons of Liberty are going to be formed. And they're going to use boycotts and the threat of violence to limit the enforcement of these taxes. Now, one of the leaders of this is going to be Samuel Adams. Samuel Adams is really, when he died, they basically called him the founder of America. He was really a person who really kind of got the whole ball rolling with the Sons of Liberty. And he was one of those people who basically was against the Stamp Act. And one of the reasons he was so against it was the idea that you cannot tax us unless we have representation. And if we don't have representation, you can't tax us. So only the colonial assemblies can tax us because we have representation in those colonial assemblies versus we don't have any in London. Now, eventually the Stamp Act is going to be withdrawn from Parliament, but they're going to make it very clear that Parliament has the power to make any laws that are going to impact the colonies, including additional taxes. Next slide. No, the tax initially was on sugar, not molasses. I'm not 100% sure why, but it was the fine product. It was you take molasses and then basically molasses is a extract of sugar. So it's basically going to be refined in England and then sold in the United States, and that's what's being taxed. So in 1767, they introduced a new tax on staples such as paper, glass, and tea. And then in 1768, the British are going to seize a ship owned by John Hancock. We're going to talk more about him. And he's going to be accused of basically smuggling. Now, there really isn't a lot of evidence as to whether or not he actually was smuggling. If there are records, well, let me say they no longer exist. So whether or not he was actually smuggling or not is kind of still up for debate, but he certainly was accused of it. And we know that because there are records behind that. Now, as a result of his ship being seized, riots are actually going to start and basically go throughout New England, and most especially in Boston. As a result of this, some 2,000 British troops are going to be deployed to Boston. Now, I did a kind of a walking tour this weekend in Boston, and one of the things that I was reminded of that I didn't really know is that there are only 15,000 people in all of Boston in 1770. So when they sent troops to Boston, they sent 2,000 troops. So there are 4,000 kind of males of, adult males in Boston, and there are 2,000 troops that have now been sent. So there's basically one troop for every adult male that lives in Boston. That is a huge disruption to obviously daily life when you suddenly have all of these troops arrive and are now going to sit on what's called the Boston Common, and that is where they're going to set up their camp. So this kind of all is going to come to a head with the Boston Massacre. So in March of 1770, there is one person, basically a soldier, standing in front of the customs house, which is where they collect the taxes. And he and this kid kind of get into this kerfuffle, we'll call it, kerfuffle. And as a result, the kid kind of runs screaming, I've been attacked. And so kind of a mob forms around this one British soldier. So the captain sees all of this going on and he's like, there's a problem. So he gathers what he can, which is about 8 other men, and they kind of all run to defend this one soldier. And now we got a crowd developing, and we've got more and more people who are gathering around the soldier. And the British captain, he's actually going to read the Riot Act. Now, the Riot Act explicitly says that we can fire upon you if we tell you to disperse and you don't. So he's literally reading out loud the Riot Act, that's actual term, and he's basically saying that any group of 12 or more people must disperse when ordered to by British soldiers. And he's reading this, he hasn't gotten to the end, and one of the soldiers goes down. So he's not been shot, but he got hit by a rock or a pellet or something. For whatever reason, he is now on the ground. And so they see this, and suddenly there's open fire. So as a result of this, 11 people are hit, 5 are going to get killed, including an African-American soldier, and this is going to be known as the Boston Massacre. So this is a print that gets printed in Boston and basically throughout the United States. Very, very quickly, it ends up in a lot of cities throughout the United States, and it's known as the Boston Massacre. Who printed this? So basically, there's a gentleman in Boston who's going to print this. He's going to become very famous. So who actually printed this Boston Massacre picture that you see here? Anyone know off the top of their heads who actually printed that or created it? Correct. It is going to be Paul Revere. Paul Revere is a silversmith, and he apparently can draw this image, and it gets it printed, and it goes all over the United States. Now, it's kind of interesting that that there are a couple of interesting elements to this particular case. The first element is Crispus Attucks. I probably pronounced his name wrong. We do know that he was an African-American, and we do know that he was 6'2". All other details related to his life are kind of murky. It kind of changes over the years as to what we know versus what we think we know versus what is legend. Most likely he was a runaway slave. who basically left his master and then changed his name, and then basically joined a ship and became a sailor. So he would have been on shore leave in Boston on the night of March 5th, 1770, got involved in this crowd, and as a result was shot and killed. He actually, I was just in Boston and I did see his gravesite. He is actually buried with in the same graveyard as John Hancock. It was Samuel Adams who made sure that all the people who were killed, all the 5 people who were killed as a result of the Boston Massacre, were given basically the equivalent of a state funeral. And he is buried with a lot of very famous people in Boston, right near Boston Common. Now, who can tell me who defended the soldiers? So there were several soldiers who were involved in the shooting. They were actually put on trial. And who was their defendant? Who was their defending lawyer? Correct, John Adams. We're going to talk a lot more about him in a minute. He actually got a lot of them off. Next slide. So then we have the Boston Tea Party. So in 1770, after kind of the Boston Massacre, the Parliament is going to withdraw all taxes, except for the one on tea. And this kind of calms everything down. But they kind of inflame it again in 1772 when they basically instruct that new royal governors and judges would be appointed by the colonies, therefore reducing the power of the colonial local authorities, the colonial assemblies. So the colonial assemblies are going to have less and less power, and the new royal governors and the new judges appointed by the king are going to have more and more power. And more importantly, they're going to be paid for by the colonists. None of that goes over very well. And in December of 1773, a group of men who are going to be led by Samuel Adams, they're going to get dressed up as Native Americans. They're not fooling anyone. No one thinks they're Native Americans, but they're going to board a ship at the East India Company and dump about $1.7 million of today's money into the Boston Harbor. That is going to be known as the Boston Tea Party. The British are furious. As a result of this, in 1774, the British are going to respond with several measures. They're going to be deemed the Intolerable Acts. And they are going to include more restrictions upon the colonial governments. These are the local assemblies. They're going to close down the Boston port, which is basically shutting down Boston, and for that matter, Massachusetts' entire economy is really based on the Boston Harbor. And if you're going to shut down the harbor, you're basically shutting down the economy. As a result, you're now going to have lots of people who are out of work. Because the Boston Harbor, you have shipbuilding, you have rope making, you have sailors, all of these people, and then you've got the merchants going back and forth as to what's being shipped. All of that comes to a complete standstill. And suddenly you're going to have a lot of people who are going to be out of work. Next slide. So the next step is we're all going to meet, we're going to talk about it. So in September of 1774, the First Continental Congress is going to meet in Philadelphia with delegates from 12 colonies. The colony that is not present is going to be Georgia. Some of the famous delegates are going to be John and Samuel Adams. We're also going to have Patrick Henry, George Washington, and John Jay. So they're really not going to resolve a whole lot, but one of the things they are going to say is we're going to have a boycott of British goods, which is a huge deal because remember, all the income that they're generating as a result of buying British goods. If we are boycotting the buying of British goods, we are basically reducing the amount of money in which the British government is collecting, which they need to pay off their debt. They are also going to urge each colony to train their own militia. That's a big deal. And they're going to send a letter to the king with their grievances. They're also going to decide to meet again in the following year if their grievances are not met. But the most important outcome for the 6 weeks that they meet together kind of in Philadelphia is there's going to be one voice, and that's going to be from America. This is new concept. So instead of the 12 colonies kind of all sending their own letters, there's going to be one letter, and it is going to come from this new entity, which is going to be America. So the 12 colonies together, one letter going to the king. Next slide. Yeah, but by the spring of 1774-5, so the spring of 1775, letters, no, we're no longer sending letters. We're in a state now of open rebellion. So by February 1775, Massachusetts has been declared by the Crown to be in a state of rebellion. So there are 2,000 British troops in Boston. They are maintaining control over Boston, but anything west of Boston is no longer accepting British authority. So kind of the local governments are now in control. There's no revenue being generated. They really don't pay any attention to the British authority that is going on in Boston. And the only reason they're holding down to Boston is because they have 2,000 British troops to basically implement British law. So the question always is, well, how did we get there? How do we set up these militias? So starting in 1632, there was a law in Massachusetts requiring that a militia meet once a month for drilling. Now, there are several laws that are going to be passed in the next 100 years, but really eventually it's going to say that there is a requirement in the colony of Massachusetts that if you are a free man between the ages of 16 to 60, you must serve in the militia. So regardless of your rich or poor, almost everyone is going to serve in the militia. It ends up being this weird kind of, bonding period. So kind of once a month on a Saturday, every man between the ages of 16 and 60 are going to kind of meet in a common area near the town. They're going to drill for a while. They're going to vote on who's going to be the leader. They're going to talk about who's sick, who died, all the gossip, and then they all go to the local pub. So this becomes a way, for bonding within the colonial period. So by 1775, the Massachusetts Provisional Congress recommends that companies of Minutemen be raised who can respond at, quote, the shortest possible notice. To do what? It's not clear. So the legislation doesn't say to force the British to return to Boston. It just says they must be able to respond. So anytime members of the British regulars or redcoats leave Boston, their movements are going to be monitored by patriots who are still in the city. So next slide. So the question is were the 13 colonies their Britain's biggest or most valuable asset? That's a very good question. I'm going to say yes. Actually, I'm going to say no. The biggest colonies and the most valuable assets are going to be in the Caribbean because that is where they're producing the sugar. So that is really going to be their most valuable assets. And they're going to send things like the Navy to make sure, and there's going to be a lot of jostling between the French and the British to try to maintain control of some of these islands in the Caribbean, because that is where they're generating the sugar, which is so valuable to the British in obviously places in Europe. Very good question. It's debatable. There's a lot of individual commerce being developed inside the United States, and there are lots of individuals who are making a lot of money, but they are very, very concerned about the Caribbean. The British are. So now the next step, of course, is war. So we're going to talk about the road to Concord, Massachusetts, and war. So here's the quote: "Stand your ground, don't fire unless fire upon, but if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." This is what the captain of the militia told his men on the Lexington Green on the morning of April 19, 1775. Next slide. So in March of 1775, the Massachusetts Provisional Congress issued the following resolution. Should a British army leave Boston, a military force should be assembled to, quote, act solely on the defensive. It's not clear exactly what they're supposed to be doing, but we want to make sure they're ready to go. So kind of in response to this, so everyone's kind of waiting to see kind of what's going to happen next. It looks as though an armed conflict is inevitable, but nobody's quite sure how this is all going to pan out. So on April 14, 1775, the royal governor of Massachusetts, he is going to receive orders from London to disarm the rebels. Great. How am I supposed to do that? So on the evening of April 17th, some 700 British regulars leave Boston on their way to Concord, where they believe a large cache of weapons has been assembled. There is a system of express riders that has been set up by the militia, by the colonists, that really go back to the time in which attacks from both Native Americans and the French were really feared. So the idea is that you would have different towns that would have different militia. So how do you communicate between these different towns? And you would send out express riders. And these express riders would go from town to town, warning people that basically we're under attack, or you need to assemble, or there's going to be a Native American attack. And so they would respond very, very quickly. So the system in 1775 was so good that people within 25 miles of Boston were aware that the British Army was leaving Boston, even while the French were still unloading the boats. Next slide. So the first battle is going to occur in Lexington. So at 2 a.m. on the morning of the 19th, the British Army are going to embark from boats in Cambridge, and they're basically going to start their march to Concord, which is about 17 miles away from Boston. So at sunrise, the advance guard of the British Army arrives in the small town of Lexington. They are met by 80 men who are part of the Lexington militia, and they are on the grounds of the Lexington Common. The captain of the militia is John Parker. He is a veteran of the French and Indian Wars. About a quarter of the men who are with him are related to him in some way. They're either cousins, brothers, married into the family. So we are talking about a very close-knit group of people who are assembled on the Lexington Common. His men are in plain sight, and they are not blocking the road to Concord. So in theory, the British could have just walked around them. Next slide. Now, nobody has orders to fire. So you've got the British over here, you've got the American militia over here. They're all kind of looking at each other. They all have armaments. Nobody's quite sure what's going to happen next until a shot rings out. Who actually fired the shot is still an unknown. Kind of when it was recorded, just as the war was beginning, people weren't sure who fired first. And then about 5 years after the war, everybody was convinced the British fired first. Who actually fired first is one of those unknown facts of history. But as a result, the British fire back, or somebody fires, everybody starts firing. The British are going to advance, they're going to charge, and the militia is going to retreat. As a result, 8 Lexington men are killed and 10 are wounded. 1 British regular is wounded. So they have basically scattered the militia. They're no longer blocking the road. They're no longer in the way. And the British have orders, and their orders are to go to Concord. They keep going. Next slide. So at 9:30 a.m., they're going to reach the town of Concord. Now, remember, they left Boston the night before, so they had now been marching all night, and they are finally going to reach the town of Concord, which is where their intelligence says there is going to be armaments that are found. So they go looking for the armaments. They don't really find that much. They just kind of start burning some of the small weapons, or they find some powder and they set that on fire. But the militia is actually waiting for them at the North Bridge, which is about a mile from the center of town. So they're waiting for the British to arrive, and kind of elements of the British Army are going to, some of them are in the town, some of them are hitting particular houses, and some of them are just kind of doing flanking maneuvers. But they find the militia at the North Bridge, and the British are going to be fired upon, and they're going to turn back. So they're going to retreat. They're going to leave the North Bridge to the Americans, and they're going to retreat into the town. They're going to all kind of gather up, and they're going to head back to Lexington. Next slide. Now they are going to arrive in Lexington, and they got a problem. They're out of ammunition. So this is not good. They are not in a good situation when they arrive in Lexington. But they are actually saved when another 1,000 British troops have arrived to reinforce them. So the British kind of have a decision to make. Do they go back to Concord and try to find this cache of weapons, or do they turn around and go back to Boston? The decision is made. We're all going back to Boston. So they start making their way back to Boston, but as they are marching back to Boston, and of course they're perfect rows, they're going to be harassed by the American militia. The American militia now orders about 4,000 men. So it's actually a larger number of people than the British have. So the British have about 1,700, but the American militia now is 4,000. And they start using tactics known as irregular warfare. So they're going to start firing upon the British, and they're going to fire upon them using houses. They're going to fire upon them using behind stone walls. They're going to fire behind trees. They're going to hit a corner, and boom, they're going to be fired upon. And this is what we now call guerrilla tactics, but at the time it was known as irregular warfare. And they're basically going to fire upon the British, and they're going to do it without orders. So you're going to have a group of 5 men. They could all be from the same family, and suddenly they're going to find a corner and they're going to start firing, and then they're going to retreat, and they're going to kind of move further down, and then they're going to do it again. So this is something the British are not used to. They're not happy about it. And it isn't until about 6 p.m. the British are going to cross the river, and they're going to arrive back in Boston. Now, as a result of all of this day's fighting, which has now been, it's about 24 hours since they have left Boston, and they are now back in Boston, quote unquote, safe. As a result, the British casualties are about 73 dead, 174 wounded. The Colonials have lost 49 men and 41 have been wounded. But we got a problem here, because the next day, the militia is now starting to arrive, and they're going to surround the city of Boston. And now we're going to have more and more people arrive. And they're coming from New Hampshire, they're coming from Rhode Island, they're coming from Connecticut, and they are going to form the backbone of the Continental Army. Now, throughout this presentation, I'm kind of going to focus on 4 people. And these 4 people are kind of the wealthiest man in America, probably the smartest man in America, one of the most prominent lawyers in America, and Thomas Jefferson. We're going to talk about each one of those. Next slide. So we're going to start here with John Adams. So John Adams in 1768 is really the most prominent lawyer in Boston, and most likely the most prominent lawyer in the colonies. So he was born in October of 1735. He was going to born in Braintree, Massachusetts, which is kind of like a small, I don't know, suburb. It's now a suburb, but back then it would have been a separate town outside of Boston. He is going to attend a school called Braintree Latin, and then he's going to go to Harvard College. In 1759, he's going to be admitted to the bar after he does his law studies. And in 1764, he's going to marry Abigail Smith. Now, it is really through his letters with Abigail Smith, they're going to spend a lot of time apart in their lifetime. And as a result, there's going to be numerous letters back and forth between Abigail and John. And a lot of what we know about John's thinking, about his habits, about his likes and dislikes, a lot of those arrive as a result of these letters that he sends, that he and his wife correspond with throughout basically both of their lifetimes. By 1765, he's going to rise to prominence due to his opposition to the Stamp Act. He is also second cousins to Samuel Adams, who was really one of the leaders of the Sons of Liberty. By 1768, he's going to be the most prominent lawyer in Boston. And as a result of this, he is going to be chosen really by Samuel Adams to provide the defense for the British soldiers who are involved in the Boston Massacre. He will basically prove that there was not an order provided by the commander to fire upon troops. Therefore, he cannot be held responsible. And the other troops, I think there are 6 in total. He gets all of them off but 2, but they get accused of or convicted of manslaughter and not of murder. Big difference in that time period. Both Samuel Adams and John Adams are going to be delegates to the First and Second Continental Congress. The days after the battles of Lexington and Concord, John Adams is going to take himself, and he wants to see the battlefield. After he sees the battlefield, basically he's going to say, okay, the die has been cast, the Rubicon has been crossed, there is no going back. Now, when we say the Rubicon has crossed, what does that mean? That is basically a kind of a throwback to ancient history. So when we talk about the Rubicon has been crossed, what does that mean? He would have been familiar with it, having studied at both Braintree Latin, where he would have studied Latin, as well as Harvard College. This would have been information that would have been taught at the time. So for those of you, if you want to put in the chat room what the Rubicon is, it's basically a river in Italy. So this goes back to Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar was at that point in rebellion to the Senate, which controlled Rome. And he was told explicitly that he could not bring his army into Rome, and he did it anyway. And kind of his last barrier to basically going down to Rome was going to be the river, the Rubicon. And once he crossed it, there was no going back. He either was going to take Rome, or he was going to be denounced as a traitor and he would lose his life. So as far as John Adams was concerned, was the Lexington and Concord was really, the die had been cast. There was no going back, and the future of America was going to be as an independent state. In 1776, he is again now in Philadelphia as part of the Second Continental Congress. He is really getting annoyed by the slow pace of progress. He really thinks that this is just taking too long, and he really doesn't think that it's something he wants. He just thinks it's taking too long. He wants to go home. He wants to go back to Boston. He doesn't want to be in Philadelphia any longer, and he doesn't want to put up with all these people talking about, we've now been at war for a year. We really just need to go ahead and declare our independence. So he's impatient with the slow pace of Congress, and so is Benjamin Franklin. We're going to talk about that next. Next slide. Now, John Adams obviously has an enormous history. He's enormously important to the United States. So during the war, for example, he becomes a commissioner to France. He spends time in France. He spends time in the Netherlands. After the war, he becomes the first ambassador to Great Britain. He comes back in 1796, and he becomes the first vice president of the United States, and he becomes the second president of the United States. So he has an enormous role to play, not only during the Revolution, but obviously in our founding of the nation. So let's talk about some of the early stages of the American Revolutionary War. So kind of the American Revolutionary War begins in April of 1775. We don't declare independence until July of 1776. So kind of what's going on in this year between the war starting and the Declaration of Independence. And I really love this quote from Thomas Paine, which is, "We have it in our power to begin the world over again." I mean, that's such a romanticized and just what a great thought, that we could take this whole world and we could just start it anew. And all of the issues of the past, you know, we can leave them in the past and we can really start anew. And people really had the feeling at the time that we could accomplish this. And I just think that that's, you know, such a grand feeling to have as we enter into the beginning of the Revolutionary War. War kind of gets rid of a lot of that, but we'll talk about that in a minute. Next slide. So again, we're going to talk about what's happening on the battlefield. So in May of 1775, there are 4,000 British reinforcements who are going to arrive in Boston. They're going to seize the area of Boston known as Charlestown, which is kind of a little bit across the river. And there's going to be the Battle of Bunker Hill. Again, I was just in Boston and I kind of saw the monument to it. The Americans are going to lose the Battle of Bunker Hill, but the British are actually going to lose more than, they're going to have 1,000 casualties as a result of this battle. So it's, in some ways, it is a victory for the British, but it's, you're losing 1,000 men. You only have, 5,000 to begin with, and you lose a quarter or, fifth of them in one battle. That's, yeah, you've given up a lot for not a lot of gain. So by June of 1775, the Second Continental Congress is going to appoint George Washington as the commander-in-chief. We're really not going to talk about George Washington again. In the spring of 1775, Washington is able to place cannons basically on the heights around Boston so they could fire down onto the British ships in Boston Harbor. As soon as the British realized that they're kind of now surrounded, because of the Boston Harbor is a deep sea port and it's kind of surrounded on three sides. So he puts the cannons very strategically so he can fire down on the British ships. As a result, the British are going to pull out. So within a year of the First Battle of Lexington and Concord, basically the Americans have taken back Boston Harbor. So the Americans are going to hold on to that basically throughout the war. Some of the other battles that are going to occur are going to be the Battle of Quebec. The Americans are going to lose that one. But the Americans are going to push the British out of both Virginia and South Carolina. But the British are going to be back, and they're going to be back with more reinforcements. Next slide. So we're kind of going to leave the battlefield behind, and now we're going to focus on politics. So there's a battle going on throughout the year of 1775 and into 1776. There's the battle going on in Boston, and George Washington is going to take his troops that have been spent the year basically in Boston, and he's going to move them south to New York, because that is where he believes that the British are coming next. He's right. That is where they're coming next. So there's a huge debate that's going on in Philadelphia as to what this physical battle means and what is going to be our reaction to it. And I really love this quote. It really kind of frames how we think of the Declaration of Independence today. So the Declaration of Independence was always our vision of who we wanted to be, our ideal of freedom and justice, how we were going to be different, and what the American experiment was going to be about. I always thought that was a great quote. Next slide. So the Second Continental Congress, remember we had the First Continental Congress that met in the fall of 1774, and their idea was we're going to meet again if our grievances are not met. So now in May of 1775, they are going to meet again in Philadelphia. They're going to be representatives from 12 out of the 13 colonies. Their first order of business is we're going to send another petition to the British Crown. Now, there is kind of a feeling among certain people that the problem is not the British king. We want to be loyal to the British king. The problem is Parliament. If we can just get Parliament to change their minds, then we can continue to be loyal subjects of the king. So that's kind of the feeling at the time, this kind of splitting of hairs. We're not at war with the king, we're at war with Parliament. Again, it's kind of trying to find that middle ground between no longer being British subjects, but at the same time, not being happy with the way in which Parliament has treated us. So we're going to send another petition to the British Crown. The king actually refuses to even receive the petition. So he's just had it. The king has had it. He's like, there's an armed rebellion. The only way to stop the armed rebellion is to literally send troops and put it down by force. The Americans are still trying to figure out if there's a way between complete annihilation at the same time, not giving in and losing not having any of our demands met. July 1775, a delegation from Georgia arrives. Now we've got all 13 colonies being represented. Now, this is where it gets a little bit, somehow in a lot of the history books, this is kind of glossed over. And what I mean by that is you have 13 delegations, and the only way that they can move forward is if they have instructions from their elected bodies back in the colony. So you are Massachusetts delegation, you already know what your orders are. You have direct orders from the Massachusetts, I think it's convention, Provisional Congress. And the order is we're doing independence. But you're from Maryland, you do not have those orders. So you can't really move forward until you basically get approval from what's called the Annapolis Convention, which is going on in Maryland. So each colony feels a little bit differently about it, and everybody has to wait for orders. They can't just make determinations without getting instructions from back home. In addition, each colony gets one vote. The majority of the delegates decide the vote. So if there are 7 delegates from, let's say, Pennsylvania, then basically it has to be to 3 to 4, and then the majority wins, and that becomes the vote on behalf of Pennsylvania. So it's a little bit confusing, and we'll talk about why this is important in a minute. Next slide. So now we're going to talk about John Hancock. So we talked about the fact that, there are 4 people we're going to focus on, and one is the wealthiest man in the United States. Now, is John Hancock the wealthiest man in the United States? Probably. He was certainly the wealthiest man in Massachusetts. Was he the wealthiest man in the colony? Probably. John Hancock was born in January of 1774 in Braintree, Massachusetts, again outside of Boston. He attends both Boston Latin. Now, the interesting thing is Boston Latin continues to exist. So there is still a school in Boston called Boston Latin. It's one of the most difficult schools in America to get into, and it is a free education. And then he also went to Harvard College. His parents die when he is very young, and he goes to go live with his aunt and uncle. His uncle owns one of the largest shipping companies in America and is known as the House of Hancock. His uncle does not have any children, so when he dies, John Hancock inherits his business, and he suddenly becomes the wealthiest man, again in Massachusetts, most likely in all of the colonies. Within 2 years of his inheritance, he's going to be elected to the Massachusetts House of Representatives, and he is a political protege of Samuel Adams. It is not clear on the records, but a lot of historians do think that it is John Hancock who is basically funding Samuel Adams' Sons of Liberty. So they have to be getting their funding from somewhere, and the idea is that a lot of that is probably coming from John Hancock. He kind of starts off as a moderate. He doesn't like the Stamp Act. He doesn't like the taxes, but he still wants to be a loyal subject of the crown. Eventually, he is going to change and become more radical, most likely under the tutelage of Samuel Adams. In May of 1775, he is going to go to the Second Continental Congress. The president who's of the Congress, I think his name was, I forget his name now. He is going to leave very suddenly, and as a result, John Hancock is going to become the president of the Second Continental Congress, and he will do so through the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Next slide. So the smartest man in America is most likely Ben Franklin. Now, how do you prove he's the smartest man in America? You can't. So we're just going to make the assumption. Some people can argue that this person was smarter. Okay, we can have that argument. But I'm going to go with the idea that he was most likely the smartest man in the colonies at the time. Now, he was born in 1706 in Boston, Massachusetts. He attended Boston Latin, but he did not complete his studies. Instead, he was kind of home taught. At the age of 17, he was apprenticed to his brother's print shop in Boston. He did not like that. He felt that he was under too much control. And as a result, he basically fled his apprenticeship and journeyed to Boston. While he is in Boston, he's going to start his own printing shop. And by 1729, he actually has his own newspaper. In 1733, he's going to publish the Poor Richard's Almanac. I'm so sorry. Now, the Poor Richard's Almanac is really going to make him very famous because this is going to be sold not only in Philadelphia, but kind of up and down all the colonies. Now, not only is he involved in obviously science and a whole bunch of other things, but he's also very much a civics leader. Now, one of the things that he really believes is that you can take a group of people together, you can sit them down, and you can try to figure out how to solve problems. And some of the problems that he sees is that there are issues with fires, obviously in Philadelphia, and everything is made of wood. So if a fire breaks out, what do you do? How do you respond? So he started getting involved with creating societies on how to do firefighting. When the French and Indian War started, or the 7 Years' War, as we call it, French and Indian War in the United States, and Europe is known as the 7 Years' War. But when that started, he helped raise the militia, which was needed, obviously, to fight against the French. He was involved in the Philosophical Society. He helped found the first libraries. He was very involved in education, and not only education at the secondary level, but also at the college level. He was very involved in the post office. He actually served as the first postmaster of the United States. He was elected to the Pennsylvania Assembly, and in 1775, he's going to be elected as a delegate to the Second Continental Congress. Now, he is very cagey and strategic in the way in which John Adams was not. John Adams was very forthright. He told people what he was thinking and what he thought that they should all do. He could be a little abrasive. Benjamin Franklin was much more cagey. He didn't actually blurt out everything that he was thinking, and he kind of partnered with John Adams. They both knew in the spring of 1775 that this was taking too long, that that the realities on the battlefield were not reflected by kind of what they were doing in Philadelphia. And they both felt that really the only way to move forward was to declare an independent state and to start setting up a government, basically, of the United States. And they really kind of felt the same way, but kind of their tactics for how they went about doing it were very different. John Adams is like, move forward, everybody else get out of my, join or get out of my way. Ben Franklin was kind of, let's go behind the scenes. Let's try to figure out how to get people to go in the same direction. Let's herd some cats. So they were very different personality-wise, but they really had the same goal, and they figured out how to work together and kind of get people to kind of go in the way in which they wanted them to. Next slide. So in February of 1776, the colonists have learned that Parliament has passed the Prohibitionary Act. I think I said that right. And they're going to establish a blockade of American ports, and they are going to declare that American ships are enemy vessels. Think about that. So you are a loyal member of the British Crown. You own a ship, and suddenly your ship is the enemy. So it's not necessarily the colonists who are declaring themselves independent, but basically the crown is declaring them traitors. So who really declares independence? Who declares us, the Americans, as enemies? The crown is not treating them as loyal subjects anymore. We're way past that. So the colonists are still trying to figure out, is there a third way? Is there a way that we can get our grievances met without actually declaring independence? And we're running out of space here. In addition, what also really upsets the Americans when they find out that the king has hired German missionaries, or not missionaries, mercenaries. And the mercenaries are going to be sent to fight the Americans. So as far as the king is concerned, they're all rebels, and we're going to put down this rebellion. So this idea that we can somehow still stay British subjects, there's really not a lot of room left for the maneuver. Now, both John Adams and Ben Franklin are of the same mind, and they basically agree that the goal of Congress should be independence. Okay, how do we get there? So they're going to try to figure out kind of how we get there. So kind of as they're trying to figure out how we're going to get there, things are moving kind of in the background. And one of the things that's happening is on May 15th, the Virginia Convention, they have voted to instruct the Virginia delegates at the Second Continental Congress to basically, they've passed a resolution that they want to present to the Second Continental Congress that will absolve all allegiance to Great Britain. This is a big leap forward. And so Richard Henry Lee is going to arrive in Philadelphia with the Virginia resolution in hand. As soon as he arrives and he reads it out loud, which is, Virginia resolves that we are going to absolve all allegiance to Great Britain, the King, and Parliament, immediately seconded by John Adams. Now what? Next slide. So now the resolution is not coming from Massachusetts. It is coming from Virginia. Virginia at the time was probably the largest and most wealthy kind of colony. And it was certainly the largest. And one of the reasons was it the wealthiest? It kind of depends on how you count things. So people they had land and they had slaves. Did they have the same amount of commerce that, for example, Boston did? Not so much. So kind of how you judge depends on, if you've got a lot of land, you're very wealthy. But of course, if it doesn't produce anything, all it does is drag you down. But you can have merchant ships, and nothing is moving because Boston Harbor is closed. So which was the most wealthy? Virginia certainly had a larger population and had a larger amount of land. So now this resolution has been introduced, and now the debate has to begin. There's no way that they can ignore this resolution coming from the state or the Commonwealth of Virginia. So there are a couple of states that are now really being thrown up in the air. They don't know what to do. So you've got delegates from Pennsylvania, Delaware, New Jersey, New York, and Maryland. They have not been authorized by their elected bodies back in their colonies to vote for independence. And some of them are really, especially the guys from Maryland, they're threatening to walk out of the entire Congress if the resolution is in fact adopted. So they debate this for about 24 hours and the decision is made, we're going to table it. So it doesn't go down in defeat. It's not passed. It's basically, we're going to put this aside for further discussion. And the purpose of all of this is to give time to allow basically the state bodies to provide new instructions to the delegates. So you're in Maryland and you need to go back to basically the capital, which is Annapolis, and basically say, here's this resolution. What do you want me to do? Do you want us to pass it? Do you want us to reject it? We can't ignore this any longer. It is all coming to a head. If you want us to pass the resolution, you need to tell us. So instead of going down and instead of being passed, it's tabled. So it's late at night. It kind of passes and John Adams like, what just happened? Because he literally thought it was going to go down. So it's not going down. It has been tabled. And so he kind of pops up out of his chair and he says, oh, yeah, Hancock. Yeah, he's been recognized. All right. Yeah. What do you want to do, John? Just get it out. Well, why don't we, why don't we set up a committee and so we can write something in case this resolution ever does get passed, that there's a legal document that we can vote upon and to send to England. John Hancock's like, whatever, I'm tired, I'm going to bed. John Adams, form your committee. Bye-bye. So John Adams is like, okay, cool. All right, we're going to form a committee. So he basically selects his committee of people who are going to write this resolution and see what happens. Now, remember, nothing has been voted on. Independence has not been decided, but just in case, we're going to draft something. So he basically picks the committee. So his committee is going to be him, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman from Connecticut, Robert Livingston from New York, and Thomas Jefferson. Next slide. So let's talk about Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was born in April of 1743. He was born in Virginia. I think I was supposed to cross that out. Somehow that stayed in there. His father died when he was young, and both he and his brother inherited about 5,000 acres apiece. He attended the College of William and Mary in Virginia, and he studied the ideas of the Enlightenment while at the College of William and Mary in Virginia. He is going to study law, and he's going to admit it to the bar. In 1775, he is going to be elected to the House of Burgess, which is basically the assembly, elected assembly in Virginia. At the age of 33, he is going to be the youngest delegate to the Second Continental Congress, and he is a last-minute addition. What do I mean by that? So the delegation was set for Virginia. Somebody had to drop out, and at the last minute, he was added. So what were his accomplishments kind of before 1776? The answer is not much. He had gone to college. He had passed the bar. He was in the House of Burgess. He really hadn't made a name for himself. It is going to be in the drafting of the Declaration of Independence that Thomas Jefferson will become Thomas Jefferson. So when he arrives in Philadelphia as the youngest delegate to the Second Continental Congress, he immediately seeks out John Adams. He's an ambitious man, and he has figured out kind of who he wants to be friends with. And one of the people he wants to be friends with is John Adams. So he becomes friends with John Adams. John Adams then adds him to the Committee of Five. Next slide. Now, this is where it all becomes a little murky. So both Jefferson and Adams wrote in letters later about who basically decided who should write the first draft. Historians are kind of split on how the decision was made, because most historians believe that John Adams thought he should write the first draft. How Jefferson ended up writing the first draft is not clear. Now, some historians have said that it was basically Ben Franklin who went to John Adams and said, look, it has to come from the South. The same way that the resolution came from the South, the first draft has to come from the South. And Adams is like, fine, but I'm rewriting it. That was his feeling because, Jefferson was 33 years old. He had never really accomplished much in his life. John Adams was basically the most prominent lawyer. This was a legal document. He really felt that he should be the one to write it. So according to Jefferson, Adams said that according to Jefferson, Adams told him he should write it because he was the better writer. Most historians think that John Adams would have never admitted that a 33-year-old who hadn't accomplished much in life was a better writer than he was. It's not clear exactly how this came about, but we do know the decision was made that Jefferson should write the first draft. So between June 11th and June 28th, Jefferson is going to work on his draft. He is going to draw considerably. He's going to draw a lot from the Virginia Constitution, the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which is written by a fellow Virginian by the name of George Mason, and from other sources, including, of course, John Locke. In the meantime, the delegates are doing their job, and their job is to go back to their states, or at least get messages back to their states asking for new instructions. There is this resolution from Virginia. It cannot be ignored. What do you want us to do? And they're going to get new instructions. So on June 14th, the Connecticut Assembly is going to vote for independence. New Hampshire, Delaware, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey are all going to follow suit. In Annapolis, and the people who are most against it initially in Maryland, there's going to be an Annapolis convention is going to vote in favor of independence on June 28th. So the only state that really is undecided, they're still waiting for new instructions from, is going to be New York. On June 30th, with British forces approaching New York Harbor, the elected body is going to flee New York City without providing new instructions. That's the reason why New York abstains. It never got new instructions from the elected body in order to make a decision on how to move forward, hence the reason they abstained. We'll talk more about that in a minute. So while Jefferson is off writing his draft, things are moving, and different states are already saying, you know what, we're on board. This is where we were going to end up anyway. Let's keep going. Next slide. So this is the first rough draft. So this has been preserved. This is obviously a photocopy of it. So this is Thomas Jefferson presented probably on the 25th or 26th, a copy of his first rough draft to the committee. So, but if you ever see any of the historical movies, it's always both Thomas Jefferson, it's always John Adams and Ben Franklin who he presents it to. They read it, it's 2 pages long, and Adams is probably for the first time in his life speechless. He really thought it was a resolution, absolving all allegiance to Great Britain, and that was it. Instead, what Thomas Jefferson has written is basically a manifesto, which is beyond anything that John Adams could have imagined. So as you can see, there are crossouts, and it's really hard to see, but if you look here where it says among the provisions of the earth, and one of the things that they're going to talk about is he's going to change it. Hang on, let's see if I get it more carefully. He's going to change some of the names, change some of the wording, and who actually makes the changes is not clear because there are no minutes taken. So who made what edit is up for debate, but historians have kind of all agreed that this very famous one, which is we hold these truths to be, and this is crossed out and instead is replaced by self-evident. The belief is that that edit was made by Ben Franklin. And then it also talks about here, kind of if you go a little bit further down, you can't see it that well, but they are endowed by their creator. That was most likely put in place by John Adams. John Adams was very religious, and he really wanted to make sure that that was included. So again, we don't know exactly who made the edits and which edits were made. We do know that this was a rough draft. We do know that changes were made to it, and we have some of that rough draft has been preserved. Next slide. So on Friday, June 28, 1776, the Committee of Five presents its copy of the Declaration by the representatives of the United States in Congress assembled. In General Congress, that was what it was called. And this is the first draft, and it is going to be presented. Now, for those of you who are looking at this picture, what do you think this is of? Done by John Trumbull. It's in the Capitol. We've all seen it. Everybody's history books has a picture of it. What do you think that they are representing in this particular picture? I can tell you what I always thought it was, and I was wrong. Anyone want to put in the chat room what they think that this is of? I always thought it was the signing of the Declaration of Independence. It's exactly. It is basically the presentation of the Committee of Five giving the first draft to Congress. And the person here in front is going to be Thomas Jefferson. And then the person here to his, if you're looking at this, his left is going to be John Adams. Then all the other people here are basically the other signers of the Declaration of Independence. So it is basically the first time in which a draft of the Declaration of Independence is presented to the Congress, Second Continental Congress. I always thought it was the signing. It isn't. It is the presentation of the first copy to basically John Hancock as the president of the Congress. So let's go to the next slide. So this is presented on Friday afternoon on July 28th. And kind of everybody's a little astounded. Nobody was really expecting something of this eloquence. I think that's a drug. Something this eloquent or something this elegant or as a manifesto. Nobody was really expecting this at all. So they were kind of taken by surprise. And a lot of people really didn't know where to go with this. So kind of the first day, there wasn't a whole lot of debate, but by the following Monday, edits are going to be made to the document. And about a quarter of this content of what Thomas Jefferson wrote is actually going to be removed, including a very powerful passage criticizing the king for importing slavery to the colonies. This will be removed from the final document. So it's 2 pages is really going to get reduced down to about 1.5 pages. So a quarter of it will be removed. Some of the document or some of the sentences will be kind of paraphrased and shortened. And Thomas Jefferson just steams, as you know, because he wrote this very, very carefully. Each word was chosen very carefully, and you've got people who are going in and editing it. And if anyone's ever had their Crown and Glory edited, they know how hard that is. But Thomas Jefferson knew that he needed kind of everybody on board, so he really allowed people to kind of cut apart his Declaration of Independence, including basically the passage about how the king imported slavery to the colonies. That is going to be removed from the final document. So by the end of the first, the vote is inevitable. But John Dickerson, who is from Pennsylvania, he is not sure he wants to do all of this, and he's going to make one more effort to delay the decision. And John Adams is going to basically squash him down. He's going to make a big speech, and he's basically going to say that this vote needs to be immediate, that we're too far. The Rubicon has been crossed. We're there. This has to go forward. So on Tuesday, July 2nd, 1776, the roll call is going to be taken. So everybody's gotten their opportunity to make edits to the document. They all have received their instructions from their state assemblies. The only question now is, Every state has to vote, and each colony only has one vote. So again, you're Massachusetts and you've got 5 delegates. It has to be 3-2 in order to win. And then that is the one colony is can vote, only gets one vote. So it's not each person has one vote. Each colony has one vote. And in order for that vote to be achieved, it has to be from a majority of the representatives that are there from that particular colony. So it really, kind of starts with New Hampshire. New Hampshire votes yay. And then you kind of go down the list. And one of the last minute is going to be South Carolina. South Carolina has been very cagey and has voted against this in the past, but at the very last minute, they're going to flip. And they're going to reverse their position, and they are going to vote in favor of the Declaration. They're vote in favor of independence. Now, the Delaware delegation is also probably going to vote against it. They had a particular delegate who has had to leave because of illness. He is basically going to get up in the middle of the night. He's going to ride on his horse, because there's riding his horse or his carriage, and he's going to go all the way back to Philadelphia, and he's going to cast his vote in favor, which is going to be the tiebreaker, because there was 1 against, 1 favor. He's now in favor. Delaware is now listed as a yay vote. Remember, all of them have to vote, and all of them have to vote yay. Then it's going to come down to Pennsylvania. Now, Pennsylvania has a delegation, a fairly large delegation, is one of the largest states. And they need to, and it looks like the whole thing is going to stop right there in Pennsylvania. And at the last minute, it's going to be Ben Franklin who's going to somehow cut a deal. And the deal is going to be that Robert Morris and John Dickerson are going to abstain. They are not going to vote. And therefore, Ben Franklin does prevail, and it becomes a 3-2 vote. New York delegation is going to abstain because it still hasn't received any new instructions from the New York Assembly, which has now fled because they believe the British are coming, which they do. A week later, they're going to vote to support independence. And that's it. And there's this silence. And then John Adams says it's done. And then they're all kind of just dumbfounded by what has just happened. And that's it. It's passed. So the next day, which is the 3rd, we can go to the next slide. They're still playing with the language. They're still making last minute edits to this document. And then finally, it's going to go to the printer. And as a result, 200 copies are made of the initial Declaration of Independence. The Declaration becomes official on July 4th. And the reason it becomes official is because Congress has now recorded its vote, adopting the document. It is going to be put onto paper, and that paper is going to be signed by John Hancock. He is the president of Congress. He will sign the document on behalf of Congress. He's the one who is signing it. Now, is he signing it? Is he printing it? It's just not clear, because as far as we know, none of those 200 original copies survived. The first formal reading of the Declaration of Independence is going to take place on July 8th in Philadelphia, in Trenton, New Jersey, and Easton, Pennsylvania. On July 9th, George Washington, who has been sent the Declaration by John Hancock, makes the decision to read the Declaration to his troops in New York City, hoping to inspire his men as the British troops have now arrived. They have parked a lot of ships in New York Harbor. There are thousands of troops, and he's in real trouble. As a result of the Declaration being read to his troops, a statue of King George has now been pulled down, and basically they melted it down, and the lead was used to make musket balls. It was a very inspiring reading. The Declaration will reach London by mid-August and the rest of Europe soon afterwards. And it really causes a sensation in Europe. The British do, and it gets published in London newspapers. And it really causes a sensation about what are these guys in these, backwards area talking about. Next slide. So let's talk about the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Now, in Washington, D.C., if you go to the National Archives building, you can see the official copy of the Declaration of Independence. It is preserved by the National Archives and is located in Washington, D.C. So where did that come from? So on July 19, 1776, Congress orders that the Declaration be engrossed on parchment and be signed by every member of Congress. So on August 2nd, John Hancock signed the engrossed copy with his famous signature, and the other delegates follow. Now, does every delegate sign on August 2nd? The answer is no, not all of them are in town. So most people, there's going to be one delegate who doesn't sign it, but 56 delegates will eventually sign the Declaration of Independence. Even New York, because while New York abstained on July 2nd, they finally did get permission from the state assembly to, in fact, vote for independence. So the 56 delegates will eventually sign. Next copy. So this is the official copy of the Declaration of Independence. And you're like, really? That's it? Yes, that's it. So the Declaration is currently being preserved in a case that monitors both its oxygen and humidity levels. And the reason why it's so faded is in about 1840, it was provided to the United States Patent Office, where it hung on the wall and exposed to sunlight, hence the fading of the ink. So it wasn't until 1903 that someone said, hey, that thing is fading, take it down off the wall. Oh, let's do that. So yeah, we took it down. But it wasn't until 1951 that the modern preservation efforts began. And it was kind of turned over to the National Archives, and it is now preserved and held by them. Each night, the case, it's on display. You can go to Washington, D.C. right now and see this copy. Can't really read it, but you can see it. Each night, it is going to be lowered into a vault and preserved that way. No, it wasn't George Mason who didn't sign the Declaration of Independence. I don't remember who it is, though, but it was not. I want to say it's Livingston. Oh, man, I may have that wrong. Okay. I guess somebody wrote that of the John Dunlap printed about 200 copies, and there are still about 25 that still exist. Thank you for pointing that out. I didn't think any of them did. Next slide. So what does this document say? Let's talk about it. Next slide, please. So here it is. This is this document that was voted on July 2nd and basically became the resolution in July 4th, 1776. Now, I'm not going to read all of it. It's too long, but I am going to read portions of it. So this is the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them to another, and to assume among the powers of the earth a separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. Next slide. So this is the introduction. So the next part is going to be the preamble, which is probably the most popular and most well-known portion of it. And the preamble says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to ensure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute a new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such a form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Now, there's more to that, but that's kind of the most famous section. Next slide. So now they have to explain why. So what is this? This is the indictment. So this is the portion of why they decided they needed to be separate from Great Britain. Such has been the patient suffrage of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former system of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having direct object of the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let these facts be submitted to a candid world. He has refused his assent to the laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. And then they go on to list basically all the things in which the king has done to basically become an absolute tyranny over the states. Next slide. And then it has kind of two other sections, but I'm going to conclude here with the conclusion. We therefore, the representatives of the United States of America and General Congress assembled, appealing to the supreme judgment of the world for the restitution of our intentions, due in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states, we have the full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all the other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And for the support of this declaration, with firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Next slide. And these are my conclusions. You can agree with them, you can disagree with them, you can come up with your own conclusions. But when these men voted for this Declaration of Independence, they are now traitors to the crown. And all of them know what happens to traitors of the crown, because just 100 years ago, they beheaded the king, and there was enormous conflict within Great Britain. But everybody knows that if you are a traitor to the crown, you can not only lose your life, but you will lose your children, you will forfeit your lands. So you will be killed, and your children's inheritance will basically revert back to the crown. So in doing what they did, they became traitors to the British crown, and they also forfeited their own lives and their children's inheritance, and probably their children's lives as well, because a lot of them, their sons would actually go to war or be involved in the revolution. So this was a huge deal what they were doing, and they knew it. And when they finally signed that document in August, they all kind of went up very, very solemnly, because they knew what they were signing, and they knew that they were most likely signing their lives away. Because as we talked about, the British had all of the advantages going into this war. They had a victorious army who had just defeated France and most of the major powers in Europe. They had a very sophisticated and basically the finest navy in the world. And the colonists basically had no way of even raising money to support this endeavor that they were doing. So the odds were against them. They were totally against them from succeeding. Britain had a larger population, it had other colonies, it had a treasury, it had a supply chain for goods that are basically needed for war. The one advantage the Americans had is the Atlantic Ocean. It is very expensive to get an army to the United States, to supply that army, to feed that army, to pay for that army across an ocean. And this really kind of proved to be the linchpin for why the colonials won. And also, you know, the fact they got aid from France absolutely helped and was vital in order to defeat the British Army. Now, the words that basically Thomas Jefferson put on paper and were read out, actually it was on July 8th that it was finally read out, would echo across the world, and for that matter, across the centuries. And it continues to be a very important document. It is obviously being preserved, and they take the preservation of the document very seriously, but it really becomes our manifesto for how we think this new nation should be created. Now, a lot of people argue that that's not how it happened, and it isn't. But the fact that it was put down on paper I think is an extraordinary achievement. And the people who went forward and did sign it really were putting their lives in jeopardy, and they knew it. And that kind of concludes my my presentation. If anyone has any comments or questions, I would be happy to put them in the chat room. I really appreciate everyone paying attention and sticking with me all the way to the end. Obviously, I went over again. My plan was to be over by 8 o'clock. Just don't seem to be able to stay within my time frame.
That's
Robert,
okay, Deirdre. That was awesome. We always want to make sure people get their money's worth. But no, thank you. That was really awesome.
Again, if anyone put anything in the in the chat room that I missed or that I should add, or do you have any comments, Robert?
Oh, no, I've just been kind of absorbing it and taking it all in and letting you drive the bus, so to speak. But yeah, if anyone has any questions or comments for Deirdre, feel free to share those in the chat or the Q&A. This program is being recorded, so if you joined us late, want to watch it again, or know anyone else would be interested, it'll be on our YouTube channel later tonight, and I'll send out an email with that link along with the links of Deirdre's other programs a little bit later this evening.
Oh, actually, why don't we go to the next slide here real quick? Just so I can, talk about some of the other presentations I have.
Oops. Uh-oh. Hold on 1 second. Hold on 1 second. Almost there. Okay.
That's a very good question. The question is it true that he signed so the king could see it? It's not clear. The first time that statement about, when John Hancock signed, he made his signature big so the king could read it without his spectacles. The first time that was published was, I believe, in 1811. So that's, almost 30 years after it was published. So whether or not he actually said it is not clear. The one thing that is pretty clear that was said, which is, I think it was Ben Franklin who said, we might as well hang together because we will surely all hang separately. And that's pretty well documented that Ben Franklin did say that, and it kind of generated a little bit of a laugh. But as far as John Hancock signing it that big, so the king could read it without his spectacles, it's not clear that he ever really said that. I'm not aware of John Adams being an alcoholic. I don't think that he was. And the reason why I say that is because his two sons ended up being alcoholics, and he was very disappointed in them. He had 3 sons that survived to adulthood. 2 of his sons became alcoholic, and 1 became president of the United States. So I'm not aware of John Adams being an alcoholic. But I do know that 2 of his sons were very much a disappointment to him, as they were unable to wrestle, as he called it, with the demons of alcohol. So that's an interesting thought. I'm not aware of the fact that he would have been considered an alcoholic. If he was an alcoholic, it was a very well functioning one, but I don't know any record of him being an alcoholic. I just know his sons were. Yeah, I was trying to figure out, how much to add about kind of the battles that were going on between May of 1775 and then, because really the 2 big battles are what's going to happen in Boston, and then the other big battle is what's going to happen in New York. And what happens in New York actually occurs after the Declaration has been declared. And obviously we lose the Battle of New York. George Washington is basically chased out of New York. He ends up getting chased through New Jersey, and it looks like the British are going to take Philadelphia. The Continental Congress flees Philadelphia. But at the last minute, I think Robert has done a presentation on the crossing of the Delaware River, and that happens on Christmas Day, 1776, and it really saves the Revolution. And so Robert does have a presentation that is available on that topic as well. So some of my other presentations, which is the shot heard around the world, which is about the first battle of the American Civil Revolutionary War. You kind of heard a lot of that throughout this presentation, but some of the other presentations I have are on Gettysburg, Rise and Fall of Empires, about the Great War. Last year was the 100-year anniversary of Irish independence. So I did a presentation on that. And then the Battle of Midway, which is the pivotal battle of the World War II. And then I also have several presentations on the Pentagon 9/11 Memorial. It's interesting because out of all of those, the one that is the most popular is the Battle of Midway, which kind of shocked me. I assumed it would be the Pentagon 9/11 because I'm kind of the only one that has one on it. But there's a lot out there about the Battle of Midway. But there's been about 2,500 downloads of that particular presentation. Yeah, he basically, John Dickerson was one of the people who was really reluctant to declare an independence. And so he was a delegate and he did not sign. Yeah, he not only wanted to remain a British subject, but he wasn't sure that he wanted, again, as somebody pointed out, the French or other people coming to aid America. He really didn't think that that was a good idea. So one of the people pointed out when Jefferson wrote that all men are created equal, Jefferson is a very, very conflicted man. So Jefferson, for example, when he was a member of the bar, actually represented slaves who wanted to be free. At the same time, he owned slaves, and when he died, a lot of his slaves were sold to pay his debts. So he wrote a lot about the evils of slavery, but at the same time, he was an active participant in it. So it's hard to clarify or kind of put in one camp or the other. He certainly wrote a lot about the problems of slavery, but he never actually went ahead and freed his own slaves. He inherited slaves as a result of his father's death, and then when he married, his wife brought in slaves as part of her dowry, and then when her father died, they ended up with even more slaves. So it's really hard to, it's very easy to say that these people were, part of the militia movement, and these people were slave owners. Unfortunately, it's sometimes it's not that cut and dry. John Hancock never owned slaves, and John Adams was a fervent anti-slavery his entire life. He never really wavered on that. Ben Franklin owned 2 slaves in his lifetime. But when he returned from France after serving as the ambassador, he freed both of his slaves and became the president of the abolition movement in Pennsylvania. So how everybody felt about slavery varies widely across, the 56 men who signed the document. Yes, when Thomas Jefferson freed Sally Hemings' children, but not her, as with the part of his. But when he died with huge debts. And a lot of his slaves ended up being sold, and a lot of his property and a lot of his furnishings all got sold to basically pay off his debts. He was very, very good at spending money, not as good at generating funds. So that is one of the reasons why he never really freed his slaves, because he felt he needed them in order to support his lifestyle, which was very expensive. Yeah, so Sally Hemings was, yes. So Sally Hemings arrived into his household as part of his wife's dowry. It is more likely than not probably that she was his wife's half sister. So both Sally Heming and Martha Jefferson most likely had the same father. And so it would have been her half sister. And then when Martha died, apparently Jefferson promised her that he would never remarry, and he never did. She died very young. She had 6 children. I want to say 2 of them, I think, survived to adulthood. He did not remarry, and eventually the according to most historians, he did begin a relationship with Sally Hemings, and he fathered several of her children. I think some people put something in the... Very good question. So the question is did Jefferson and Adams die close to each other? The answer is yes and no. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams had an enormous falling out in 1800. They were basically running against each other for president of the United States. And Thomas Jefferson knew he was going to lose, but he was furious, or I'm sorry, Adams knew he was going to lose, but he was furious with Thomas Jefferson for basically putting his hat in the ring for it. So they had a huge falling out and didn't speak for years. And then finally, they did kind of start sending letters back and forth to each other. They really never talked about politics, but they kind of talked about their experiences, what was going on in their lives, and they really started up their friendship yet again. Both of them died on the same day. Both of them died on the 50th anniversary. So 1826, on July 4th, both Jefferson and Adams die on the same day. So supposedly when Adam dies, he says, but Jefferson lives. But what he didn't know is that Thomas Jefferson had already died earlier that day. So they both died on the same, and they also, John Adams died at the age of 90. So he was, not only was he very involved in the creation of the country, but he was also very helpful in kind of writing a lot of the what we know now about the colonial period. A lot of it comes from the writing of both Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. They were both very good writing of letters, and a lot of them ended up getting preserved. And as Patty's pointed out, he did design Monticello. It was one of the big sources of his debt, but he also had a very large library, but he also spent huge amounts of money when he was overseas. It's kind of an odd set of circumstances, but at the time you were expected to kind of pay all your expenses as ambassador to France. And a lot of people didn't have that kind of ready cash. And when he returned from France, I want to say he brought back, I don't know how many carts and wagons, but you know, more than basically most men could accumulate in a lifetime. He was accumulating things. Yes. As somebody else had pointed out, his wife, this is Martha Jefferson, most likely had post-pregnancy diabetes, and she basically had difficulties, obviously, in labor, and then she died, I think, after she gave birth, and died pretty soon after that. Yeah, and I think as Patty has pointed out, Jefferson mortgaged a lot of his properties. So when he died, you know, what he did have were slaves, and they could be sold for cash. And that's what happened after he died. So some of the questions from the Q&A, that was a very good question. So one of the questions is the 4 colonies that made up Canada, were they invited to the Continental Congress? And the answer is yes, they were. They were certainly invited to the First Continental Congress. For example, Georgia was invited to the First Continental Congress, but they didn't arrive, but they did come to the Second Continental Congress. But Quebec and Montreal, I think it was Quebec, and Toronto were invited, but they never attended. Very good question. The other question is whether there's another name for the United States ever considered. Not that I'm aware of. That's a very good question that I just don't have an answer to. Did the British have any idea the Declaration was in the works? Well, I don't think it mattered to the British at this point. I mean, the Americans were in open armed rebellion against them. The Declaration was really just codifying the reality which was already taking place. So whether or not there was a declaration, what it was going to say would have been irrelevant to the British. What they were trying to do was put down the open armed rebellion. That was where their interest lied. The fact that these people were meeting in Philadelphia, most of them they never heard of, they really weren't as concerned about what these people were doing. That's a very good question. So what was the relationship between the colonial assemblies and the royal governors? Depend on what time frame we're talking about. By 1775, they were basically both ignoring each other. So the royal governors thought they had the power to absolve the colonial assemblies. The colonial assemblies at that point were ignoring anything the royal governors had to say. So it depends on what time frame you are talking about as far as who could dissolve who. But by 1775, they were basically all putting out proclamations and laws, and they were basically going past each other. Good question. So is the signing of the Declaration of Independence a pivotal moment when they stopped being British subjects and became Americans? The answer is yes. That's why it's so important. We are in rebellion, but now we are explaining the fact that the rebellion is real, and we are going to create our own government, and we are going to create our own laws, and we are no longer subject to the British Crown. That's why it's so important. Let me see if there are any other questions I can. Inalienable. Inalienable is a very good, it's one of those things that can mean different things to different people. Inalienable means that it can never be taken away. So it really goes back to the idea of Thomas Hobbes, which is that he said that all people are created equal, and but there needs a social contract, obviously, with the sovereign. But one of the things that John Locke basically took that and said, no, that these are natural rights, that the king can never take them away from them. So these are rights that an individual has, and that there's nothing the king can say or do to take those away. They're given to us by nature or by our creator, or whatever term you want to use, but they're not something that a king can just pass a law or by declaration remove from an individual. And those, of course, are life, liberty, and what we call the pursuit of happiness. One of the questions is the Native American Crispus Anchucks, was he half Native American? We believe so. Again, it's not clear. Nobody's done a DNA test on his remains. But the assumption is that he was most likely an African slave, and he probably had Native American ancestry as well. But again, nothing is really clear about him other than we know how tall he was. He was 6'2", he had a very unique name, and he was most likely at one point a slave that had run away from his master and joined basically a ship, which is something that Native or African slaves, people who were runaway slaves, that's one of the things in which they did, was they joined a ship. He would have been accepted just because of his sheer size. He would have been a valuable asset on a ship. One of the questions is the Articles of Confederation. Oh gosh, I'm going to get the date wrong. The Articles of Confederation were adapted after the war. The Constitution was passed in 1788. So I want to say that they were passed in 1784, 83, somewhere around there. So they were the precursor to the Constitution. Okay, the exact wording, I don't, so the question is can you repeat that which Jefferson had in his draft about the king and slavery that was edited out by the other delegates? The indictment part of the Declaration of Independence is basically all the things in which the king did to create an absolute tyranny, the way in which Jefferson phrased it. And one of the things in which he wrote was that the king implemented slavery in the colonies. And that's what he accused the king of doing. That was removed really on behalf of, I believe it was both South Carolina and Pennsylvania, but the belief was at the time that really not a lot of the other delegates wanted it in there either. Adams did, but well, not everybody who was at their own slaves. A lot of them were kind of involved in the slave trade, or at least benefited as a result of the slaves. So they were not as interested in kind of getting rid of slave, or they didn't want that passage in there either. Has the exact wording survived? I think so. I just don't know it off the top of my head. I didn't write it down. I don't know the answer to that question, which is I really haven't studied the Articles of Confederation. The question is, was there an earlier version of president under the Articles of Confederation before Washington became the first president? I don't think so. Kind of the concept of the executive branch was really part of the Constitution, not necessarily the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of the Confederation was much more about the power of Congress, and kind of left, everything else kind of with the individual states. Somebody else put in there about Franklin's son. Ben Franklin had one son. He was an illegitimate son, but he did recognize him. He became the royal governor of New Jersey. He was against independence and was eventually held as prisoner by rebel forces. Yeah, his wife died when he was in prison, and he was not even allowed to visit her on her deathbed. When the war ended, his son went to England, and really their relationship was never repaired. He did have a illegitimate grandson, and that's really who he kind of raised after his son and he parted ways. Did Jefferson and George Mason know each other? Yes, but kind of, they would have known of each other. They were both from Virginia. They both went to college of William and Mary. I think they both served in the House of Burgess. So yes, they would have known each other. Were they best friends? I don't know the answer to that question. I apologize. It is 8:33. I've been talking for about 2 hours. I do think one of the questions that Patricia added here in the Q&A is, why was sugar considered such a luxury? Sugar was not produced at that time in the colonies. It was produced in the Caribbean, and it had to be refined. And it was a product that was very highly prized in Europe, and its supply was basically limited. So you had a high demand, you had limited supply, and i.e. it becomes a luxury product. And it also tasted good. It was very helpful to put into your tea and do baked goods, and people really in Europe, some of them became very obsessed with it. But again, it's all about supply and demand. There was limited supply and a very high demand. Okay, Robert.
Deirdre, you've done so many great things for our group, both online and in person. Thank you much. Really, really appreciate that. But that being said, are you researching any other topics that you might be doing talks on?
Not at the moment.
If you're not, no problem. Just was curious.
Not at the moment. I really don't have.
Totally understandable.
I think that the next one is probably going to be the 9/11 again. Probably again, I'll do a live one in August, and then again right before September, and then I'll probably do one in the fall. I just haven't come up with it yet. And what about you, Robert? I'm very excited actually to see the Gettysburg. I'm so excited that you're able to do the live streaming of that. So I'm looking forward to seeing that.
Deirdre, you get all the credit.
I've seen that movie a couple of times.
I don't know if you heard me when I streamed it, but you get all the credit for that, because with that time we drove down to Richmond, you brought that movie up, and I'd seen it before, but not in many, many years. And then after, I think we went down there to see the Napoleon exhibit.
Yes, which was fascinating.
And yeah, so you were sitting behind me in the van, and we were talking about it. And then I think maybe like 6 months or a year later, I ended up watching the movie, and then I was like, oh, this is really cool. And then I've been meaning to stream it over Zoom. I just haven't gotten around to it. So I know it's been quite a while since we went on that trip to Richmond with the group. So we rented a bus. And it was pre-COVID. For those listening, we rented a bus, and we drove from DC down to Richmond to see this Napoleon exhibit they were having at the Virginia Museum. And Deirdre mentioned the Gettysburg movie. I think you might have said it was like your favorite history movie, or one of your favorite.
It really is.
And so yeah, I've been meaning to stream it for a long time. I finally got a chance to do it, and it made sense to do it around the time of the anniversary. So you really get all the credit for that. So a lot of these ideas, a lot of these things that we do, I don't actually have the ideas. They're other people's ideas. I just the one that kind of carries them out. So you actually get all the credit for that one.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I really the Gettysburg one the presentation that is available, I was a little intimidated by doing it. The Battle of Gettysburg is such a well-known historical event, and you've got people who know so much more about it than I do. So I was, I got to make sure I have all the generals' names and they're correct, and which one had first corps versus second corps. And I was almost nervous about making sure I had everything absolutely. Obviously I want to make sure I have all my facts accurate, but again, it was a little, could be a little intimidating trying to make sure that I had all my ducks in a row.
Oh yeah, well, especially if you're answering questions, because
Yes.
I don't know. I know you went. You've been to Gettysburg, but one time we went up there with our bus group, and we were talking to the park ranger, and I think I asked him like, what was the hardest part of doing the job there, and he said, "Oh, the hardest part is these people travel from all over the U.S. here, and they want to know like what their relatives, unit is doing. So you have to remember like." Yeah, my great great was in the 47th Wisconsin, and where were they?
Where were they?
It's like, well. So those were the kind of questions
people coming in, and they're like, "Who won?"
Yeah.
So you've got people who have such very, very specific questions, and then you've got other people.
Oh yeah.
Who know nothing. What happened here?
Yeah.
How many people were involved? When was it? What war?
Yeah. Like I always remember this one time we did this program. Hopefully this person isn't listening, but we did a program on the Beatles, and somebody asked me if like what time John Lennon was born, because I said he was born on November. I don't remember the exact date. They're like, what time was he born? And I was like, I don't know.
That level of specificity I don't have.
I don't know what exact time he was born. I just know the date.
Well, one of the interesting things about the time frame is that they switch time. This is going to sound so odd, but they changed from like the Julian calendar to the Georgian calendar. Calendar. So all the dates in which people think they were born and the date in which I have here are totally different. So John Adams thinks he was born the year before, but in actuality, he was born this year.
Well, yeah, isn't that George Washington too? His birthday, if you look at it, it has two different dates.
Yes.
And then going back to the movies, so next year's a lot of 80th anniversary stuff with World War II. So we were going to stream I was talking about this with Patty the other day. We were going to stream have you ever seen The Bridge Too Far?
Love that movie.
Oh yeah, so it's really epic.
Love
it's
that
like
movie.
Gettysburg. It's really epic. So I'm going to do that one, but have a year to prepare for that one.
And that's a very interesting topic, that particular battle, because obviously a lot of people know about D-Day. And the question is who won and who lost? And it's these people are still debating that one. And it was the British plan, and Eisenhower went along with it. Was there enough time to prepare? I mean, there's so many different layers to that particular battle. And it is quite fascinating, and just the sheer magnitude of it. More people were dropped because of Operation Market Garden were dropped from the air than a D-Day. So
Well, and just a movie. I mean, it's an epic movie before computer graphics with this all-star international cast.
Yes. And it had very good, a lot of when it was made, a lot of the people involved were still alive. So you had a lot of input from people who were there.
So we'll do that one next.
Good.
And then I don't know if you heard I can't remember if I told you this or not. So I have the DVD for the Ken Burns series, and I was going to stream that whole thing. But that's a big time commitment, and right now because of my work schedule, I can't commit to anything like that. But yeah, I was thinking maybe like in the fall I was going to do that. So FYI. So if you haven't seen the Ken Burns documentary in a while,
I haven't seen that in forever, so that would be interesting. But yeah, that's a huge time commitment.
Oh yeah. So, but one of these days, coming down the plate. So, all right. Well, does anybody else have any questions for Deirdre before we sign off for the night and go get dinner or do whatever it is all of us are going to do?
Dinner that was supposed to be at 6 is now 8:30.
Uh-oh. All right. Well, I think that does it for this evening. Deirdre, thank you so much. Greatly appreciate you sharing all your knowledge with us on this really, really important topic, especially since we're approaching the 4th of July. And again, just as a reminder, this program is being recorded. So I'll post the recording tonight since I have the time to do so today. And I'll send out the link and you can check that all out in the near future. Any more final thoughts for us, for Deirdre, on the Declaration of Independence, 4th of July, or anything else of interest?
Nope, not at the moment. I just appreciate everyone for attending and for adding such great questions in both the Q&A and the chat room. And as always, Robert, I appreciate you hosting.
Oh, no, we appreciate you, Deirdre. Thank you so much. All right, have a great rest of your evening or day, depending on what time in the world you're calling from, and see you next time.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.